Okay, so for my TOK presentation, I decided to examine the real-life situation of O.J. Simpson and his criminal versus his civil trial in the American justice system. So, for my decontextualization of this real-life situation, the hardest thing for me was figuring out which aspect of my real-life situation that I was going to use, because there were a lot of things to choose from regarding this case. One of them was society's opinion regarding the case because it was filmed. Another was the racism in America and that discussion. Another one was how money and fame, such as O.J. Simpson had, can affect the outcome of a criminal trial. And the last one was how one verdict can be found in a criminal case and another separate verdicts can be found in a civil trial. So I decided to stick with that one and only focus my time with that. And I mostly decided this because I was having trouble figuring out which areas of knowledge and ways of knowing would best exemplify my real life situation. And once I decided to go with the differing court systems, I figured out that ethics would be the best way to address my real life situation. So, having determined all of this, I moved into figuring out a knowledge question for my real life situation, which came out to be: to what extent is it ethical to try someone for the same or similar charges in two different courts of law? So obviously my area of knowing is ethics, because I wanted to look at the moral principles regarding the criminal and civil cases, not just with O.J. Simpson, but in relating cases where this has also been seen throughout history. And I wanted to see how, if there is a conflict in between the two court systems, how can we as a society accept that and allow it to keep happening? And then for my ways of knowings, I chose imagination, emotion, and reason. And I chose imagination because I wanted to explore the personal engagement that the jury had in making the decisions for both his criminal and his civil cases. And I also thought that emotion tied into the imagination as well, and personal tolls that the court cases took on the jury, being sequestered and having the outside pressures from society. And then my last one was reason, because I wanted to discuss how reason can be used to justify him being in two different criminal and civil trials. For my first development, I'm going to talk about the imagination and emotion behind the trial. And my claim is: the standard of evidence for civil versus criminal trials are different, therefore different courts have conflicting verdicts. For criminal cases, the standard of evidence is beyond a reasonable doubt, meaning that there is no room for imagination in this court setting. So any of the evidence that is presented during any kind of a trial, the jury is expected to focus only on that and not apply any kind of outside knowledge or anything to the case to keep it fair for the accused. Differing from this, civil cases only require predominance of evidence, pretty much meaning that you just have to prove that the accused may or most likely was the one who committed the crime, and that's all that is really needed for the jury to hold him or her liable for whatever the crime may be. For my counterclaim, I wanted to discuss that all the evidence in a criminal versus a civil trial is either the same or similar. Therefore, the decision process in each should be the same. So even though the standards of evidence for a criminal and a civil trial are different, the evidence is the same. Therefore, no matter what happens, I felt personally that it shouldn't affect whether or not I feel like it shouldn't be considered differently, because no matter what happens, the evidence is still persistent throughout. And that evidence is what ultimately conjures a decision out of a jury. and I wanted to investigate how in one court of law it could be seen as one way, and then in a different court of law it could be seen in a different way, and therefore gave different results. And relating back to my real life situation, that is something that happened in the O.J. Simpson trial, because he was found not guilty in the criminal trial because the jury could not, beyond a reasonable doubt, convict him of the murders that he was accused for. And the imagination of the jury is definitely taken into account there, because if they had allowed that gap that was unaccounted for with O.J. Simpson to influence their opinion and their emotion, being honest through that, then his results could have been completely different. For my last way of knowing, I chose to examine reason as a way of knowing. My claim for this is double jeopardy protects the accused for being tried for the same or similar charges. And I chose reason for this because, as we know, double jeopardy is something that doesn't allow somebody who is accused to be tried again for same or similar charges. And as we see in this investigation, even though the two court cases are a different court of laws, it's not considered double jeopardy. So when looking at the victims' families and friends who are normally trying to get justice for their loved ones who didn't get the results that they wanted in one of the cases, they use their reason and they use the way that the American justice system works to allow them to go into a different court of law, such as civil law, and get some kind of liability held against the person. So as we see in my real life situation, the family of the two victims that were murdered in the OJ trial later both families filed a civil trial against O.J. Simpson for wrongful deaths, and those were reasoned by the family saying that they were looking for justice and they didn't even necessarily want the reward. It was more of a peace of mind for them to move forward with their lives, having some kind of liability held against O.J. Simpson. To conclude my presentation, we're going to take another look at my knowledge question, which is, to what extent is it ethical to try someone for the same or similar charges in two different courts of law? And my conclusion is that it is not ethical to do so. I don't think that it is fair to accuse somebody of being guilty and then have them go on a trial and then them prove their innocence or prove that they're not guilty, then later be held accountable for those same actions in question in a different court of law, because I think that the two contradict themselves, and it doesn't make any sense looking at it from a humanitarian perspective, in my opinion, that a man can be guilty and innocent just because we're talking courts of law, but not necessarily what is ethically and morally correct. And my counterclaim for this is that it can be ethical when both courts of law are in agreement. So if there was a criminal trial that found somebody as not guilty, and then there's a civil trial that also agrees and it finds the person not liable for whatever the similar charges were, then the courts are in agreement, and that ethically is plausible and makes sense. So back to my real life situation, as I've been discussing, OJ was found not guilty for his criminal trial for murder, but he was held liable for wrongful death in his civil trial that was later filed after his not guilty verdict. And this was able to happen because of the standard of evidences and the imagination that's left up to the jury and their decision making. And then the reason behind the victims' families for trying the accused in a different court of law instead of just allowing double jeopardy to take its rightful place and accept the first for what it is. So that is it.